friends and colleagues, welcome to this lecture. And I'm happy to see such a good turnout on a Friday morning. We will have the honor of listening to, the honor and pleasure of listening to Professor Yrjo Engestrom from the University of Helsinki. I'm especially happy to serve as the chair here since I think the time to have Yrjo as an invited lecturer in our community is long overdue. And it has been for some time. As you know, you can only be invited as a lecturer once in a lifetime, so this is the opportunity. But I'm also happy to serve as chair because I happen to know Yrjo very well personally. We were PhD students at the same time, and I remember that Yrjo used to visit our apartment in Gothenburg on repeated occasions in those days. We also have a history of diverse range of extracurricular activities, including playing tennis together. Yrjo Engestrom is Professor of Adult Education at the University of Helsinki. As you see here, he is the Director of the Center for Research and Activity, Developmental Learning, the acronym CRADE, which is a very vibrant, international and dynamic research center at the University of Helsinki, with many scholars and a stream of PhD students passing through. Yrjo has contributed significantly to the conceptual development of the branch of sociocultural research that is known as activity theory, and is widely cited and known for this work. I don't know if you've read the book by Ludwig Fleck from the 1930s on thought styles. If you haven't, I would recommend it. But what is particularly inspiring about the thought style of research by Yrjo and his colleagues is the manner in which they address issues of learning and knowledge use and production by engaging in interventions in diverse social practices and institutions, and then managing to bring back findings to the theoretical and conceptual level for further refinement. The ability of keeping both the interventionist and the academic agenda together, I think, is exemplary and far better than what we see in action-oriented research in general. The reason why this is so successful, in my opinion, in this team is that they approach the field with a worked-out theoretical perspective, which they trust. Also, the theoretical focus on contradictions and tensions in institutional practices, and how collectives and individuals work their way through such phases of uncertainty and unease. The very notion of learning requires a much broader and theoretically more relevant meaning, far from the purely reproductive conception of learning that dominates our field. I think Yrjo as an organization has much to learn from such expanded interpretations of how to conceptualize learning and development. Learning is challenging, often painful, and even dangerous, and such qualities generally get lost in one-dimensional interpretations of what it means to learn. It is a pleasure to have you here, Yrjo, and we're looking forward to hear about your recent work. You have slightly changed the title of your talk, but it's up there. And we will organize this session in such a fashion that Yrjo will give his lecture, but he has promised to leave plenty of time for questions afterwards. And we have microphones that will be selected so you can raise questions after the lecture. Thank you. Welcome, Yrjo.
Thank you, Roger. When we played tennis together, I realized that I should call him the Björn Borg of educational research, because I always lost. And thank you for the organizers of this conference for inviting me. It's a wonderful opportunity and pleasure and honor. Now, my topic is expansive learning across space and time, critical encounters and material anchors. And perhaps you could read between the lines in Roger's introduction a slight warning that this is going to be dense and relatively complicated. So if you walk away confused, that's very good. So my question here is, how is a local innovation distributed and generalized so as to have widespread and sustainable societal impact? Obviously, this is not just my question, it's a wide-ranging question that worries people across communities of research around the globe. And In this case, the approach I will pursue is what is called often the third generation activity theory, which looks at transformations and learning in multi-activity fields. And expansive learning, the theory of expansive learning, which emphasizes that learning also includes learning things that are not yet there. In other words, while you learn, you also construct something entirely new. And in this case, the issues have to do with generating expanded objects for the activities involved. I will approach this topic through two classical dimensions, namely space and time. Space, in this context, refers to issues of scaling up, as it's usually called, diffusion, proliferation of innovations in space. And time refers to sustainability, continuity, durability of innovations. Now space. In other words, the issues of scaling, diffusion, proliferation. The proliferation and generalization of educational innovations in particular is currently framed as the issue of scaling up. The scaling up is typically depicted as the spreading of an innovation in concentric or nested circles, starting from a local classroom, then moving outward to the school, the community or district, and the nation. This is very powerfully presented, for instance, in some recent work of Lauren Resnick. While this is clearly a familiar and understandable view, it is also somewhat restrictive. Radical or so-called disruptive innovations often spread differently, namely rather independently of the original location, being picked up and cross-fertilized by actors in distant locations that then might become globally networked. A good example would be, for instance, the Linux operating system that certainly was not spreading through concentric circles, but in a very different manner. I would like to, at the risk of simplifying greatly, identify three possible mechanisms of scaling up. One I would call imitation. It could be also called contagion. The second one would be transplantation, and the third one, negotiation and cross-fertilization. Briefly about each one. The first one, imitation or contagion. This is a situation where actors hear about an attractive innovation and want to adopt it. They undertake pilgrimages to the site of the original innovation. We have been witnessing this in Finland lately, when visitors come to pick up some secret of the Finnish success in PISA assessment. Luckily, this success is kind of fading away, so the pilgrimages probably will also follow suit. There is often an attempt to package the innovation so that it could be, you could put it in a suitcase, return home, and put it into practice. Transplantation is, in a way, just the other side of the same coin. The innovation is promoted or dictated from top down. Aggressive marketing and/or administrative commands and sanctions are used to enforce the transplantation. The aim, again, is rapid multiplication, which requires that the innovation is standardized and packaged so as to allow implementation and scaling up with minimum modifications. Obviously, both of these two approaches have some limitations. They tend to lead to relatively encapsulated changes that cannot easily be sustained due to mismatches with the local context and history. In other words, there's the famous phenomenon, as long as there is extra funding, we do it, but when that fades away, forget it. This means that changes generated this way are often gradually watered down turned into technical forms and rules without much new content. Now, the third option, which I call negotiation or cross-fertilization, would refer to a situation where actors interested in the innovation engage in dialogue with the originators of the innovation, with one another, and with their end users. The parties have different, partially conflicting interests and motives. The innovation is modified and diversified to meet the needs of local contexts. This allows also further development of the original innovation. Negotiations between the originators, the adopters, and end users may evolve into long-term development of partnerships and networks. Now, the notion of negotiation is very important here. Most negotiations are compromises. They lead to sort of no news, but some sort of a, okay, everybody walks away with the minimum damage, basically. However, studies of negotiations point out that there are also what are called transformative negotiations. Particularly Linda Putnam's work has been quite important in this domain. She writes, transformation differs from interest-based and integrative bargaining through moving the conflict to a different dimension of discussion rather than focusing on interests and needs. Once disputants have reached new understandings, they might engage in problem solving, but the problems may be fundamentally different from the ones presented in the earlier stages of negotiation. In other words, the very issues are transformed. This leads me to the first key concept that I'm proposing as a fundamental mechanism for this type of expansive learning, namely critical encounter. Transformative negotiations can be seen as closely related to the notion of critical encounter. And here I go back to the classical work of Lev Vygotsky. For him, a conflict of motives was the starting point of the emergence of novel volitional actions, which transformed the situation. Conflicts of motives typically burst into the open in interactions between people. A conflict of motives is triggered or actualized by the tension between the parties, but it is not reducible to a disagreement. A conflict of motives is genuinely also an inner conflict for each participant, each subject, between seemingly incompatible ways ahead. In efforts to implement innovations, we can identify regularly occurring interactional situations which engender conflicts of motives. I call such recurring situations critical encounters. Critical encounters are important triggering events of expansive learning. And to understand this triggering mechanism, we need to go to Vygotsky's notion of double stimulation. For Vygotsky, the principle of double stimulation refers to the possibility to overcome a paralyzing conflict of motives by using an artifact, a cultural artifact, as a what we call second stimulus, to transform the situation and take volitional action. The familiar example being that if you have to wake up tomorrow morning early, you don't want to wake up early because you want to sleep, but on the other hand, you have to wake up because there is an important meeting. What do? You use an alarm clock. But it might be that when you have set the alarm, you actually wake up 5 minutes before because you have already internalized the challenge. In a critical encounter, one or more subjects may actually employ artifacts in this way as means to get out of the paralyzing situation. To identify and analyze such sequences of double stimulation, we need to put special focus on the artifacts employed and the volitional actions that they trigger. So now I have tentatively suggested that in order to study from this perspective, these kinds of processes of distributed expansive learning, when people are trying to adopt or appropriate innovations, we might use the lens of critical encounter. Now, the time dimension, which has to do with sustainability and continuity of the innovations. Again, 3 models of change might be pointed out. First of all, linear ones, which see change as stepwise progression toward a predefined goal. This would correspond roughly to the notion of time's arrow in Stephen Jay Gould's famous categories. The second basic model of change in time would be called punctuated equilibrium. This also comes from Stephen Jay Gould, where change is seen as lengthy periods of incremental development, practically equilibrium, punctuated by shorter but radical periods of transformation. And the third model would be cyclic, where change is seen as continuous cycles or spirals of transformation, which would correspond more closely to Stephen Jay Gould's notion of time cycle. Now, some comments on each one. The linear notion of change sees change as happening by means of planning, controlling, and measuring. And sustainability often requires coercion. The problem is resistance and deviation. The punctuated equilibrium sees change as evolution and crisis. Sustainability is not really an issue because evolution takes its own course in any case. The problem is there's very little, if any, room for human agency. Now finally, the cyclic notions, which see change as continuous cycles or spirals of transformation. Change is seen as accomplished by human efforts bounded by institutional and historical circumstances. Sustainability requires stabilizing of objectifications or ratchets, to use Michael Tomasello's notion, that somehow some sort of mechanisms or objects are created which prevent the innovation from fading away. Problem: what energizes and drives the human change efforts in this type of view? In the theory of expansive learning, the cycle, because this is indeed a cycle theory, the cycle is energized by historically accumulated contradictions in the activity systems in question, and the conflicts or motives generated by these contradictions among participants of the activity. Now, the issue of ratchets, or the how to stabilize and provide for continuity and durability. Here I use Ed Hodgins' notion of material anchors, which I find quite useful. He writes, material anchors may increase the stability of conceptual structure, enabling more complex reasoning processes than would be possible otherwise. In order to produce and manipulate a stable representation of the conceptual elements involved in such computations, the elements must be somehow held or anchored in place. The holding in place is accomplished by mapping the conceptual elements onto a relatively stable material structure. This is how a material medium becomes an anchor for conceptual blending. If conceptual elements are mapped onto a material pattern in such a way that the perceived relationships among the material elements are taken as proxies, consciously or unconsciously, for relationships among conceptual elements, then the material pattern is acting as a material anchor. This may sound a little bit abstract. I'm sure that this will become concrete when I proceed. In expansive learning, the second stimulus, which I talked about briefly, the artifacts, remember the alarm clock example. The second stimulus adopted by the participants to transform the situation is a material anchor. Such material anchors may be offered to the learners by interventionists, or they may be constructed by the learners themselves. In any case, to become effective means of double stimulation, they must be appropriated, molded, and agentically used by the learners themselves. They don't remain as packages. So, now I have proposed two lenses for studying this phenomena, namely critical encounter and material anchor. I will examine two cases of appropriation and diffusion of innovations as processes of expansive learning distributed in space and time. These cases are first, the case of what is called the change laboratory method, and second, the case of fostering sustainable physical mobility in home care for the elderly. So these are two very different cases. I will examine these cases using these two conceptual lenses. A note about the difference between these two cases. Case one, the change laboratory, is an innovation that spreads and gains sustainability in globally distributed and loosely interconnected sites of implementation. It's not a local innovation in the sense of spreading through nested circles or gradually growing from smaller to bigger. It is something which is popping up around the world. The second case is more traditional in this sense. Fostering sustainable physical mobility is an innovation that spreads and gains sustainability in locally distributed, relatively tightly interconnected work units of elderly care in the city of Helsinki and potentially beyond. So these are also two different cases in the sense of the starting image of how the diffusion happens. And now the first case, appropriation of the change laboratory method as a globally distributed process of expansive learning. This innovation, change laboratory, some of you might have come across with it in literature or otherwise. It's a formative intervention method developed in Helsinki since 1995, based on the theory of expansive learning. A group of practitioners or community actors meets 6 to 10 times for sessions, each lasting perhaps a couple of hours, typically once a week, to analyze and redesign their activity or activity systems. With then some follow-up meetings some months or perhaps even a year later. These sessions are carefully planned to trigger specific expansive learning actions, but there are always also deviations from the plan as the participants gradually take over and redirect the process. In such a change laboratory process, there are two kinds of important movement which are foundational, namely between the past, the present, and the future. You could say that that's the time travel movement, and horizontally between the mirror material, the first stimuli depicting problems and troubles in the activity, and the models, conceptual models that are employed and used to analyze and redesign the activity, which might be called the second stimuli, and then emerging solutions, which are situated in a way between these two. And here we have a very simplified, basic image of a layout of such a setting, change laboratory setting. And here's a more real example of a change laboratory session in a healthcare organization. Now, the spreading of the change laboratory, it has an interesting and lengthy history. The first change laboratory was conducted in Finland in 1995, and the first research article was published in 1996. So this is basically a 20-year history. For the first 10 years, numerous implementations and studies were conducted in Finland. The first research article on this change laboratory outside Finland came out in 2007 and was based on an intervention conducted in New Zealand. The first academic dissertation devoted to change laboratory outside Finland came out in South Africa by Yrjo Engestrom in 2010. Now, in the past 5 years, there's been a very rapid acceleration of the international adoption of this method. Implementations are taking place in all continents, and we're having a great challenge to try to follow and cross-fertilize communities. So it's a lengthy trajectory, and now about the first lens, the critical encounter. Here I will use briefly an example of, from last week. So you can see that this is work in progress, and you can blame all shortcomings on this. Last week, two groups of adopters of the Change Laboratory came to Helsinki to discuss their designs and experiences of implementation with the originators. One of the adopter groups, which consisted of 14 members, came from Taiwan. They had implemented a Change Laboratory process aimed at transforming the pedagogy of a senior high school in Taipei, which would serve as a pilot for other schools in creatively implementing the curriculum guidelines for the newly introduced 12-year basic education. The other group in this meeting came from Helsinki, consisted of 3 members in this session. They had implemented a Change Laboratory to transform the pedagogical management of a university-affiliated primary school in Helsinki. This is a picture from the session. Basically, it's an encounter where people who have tried to use and implement an innovation come back to discuss with the originators of the innovation. In this session, the very first issue that you could call made it critical was that usually a Change Laboratory includes maybe 15, perhaps up to 25 people, kind of a pilot group who are intensely involved in the change effort. Now these Taiwanese people, they started with 6 teaching conferences with altogether 175 teachers, 3 student conferences with 68 student representatives, 2 core groups, 1 administrative staff and 1 for teachers, and they also had a systemic innovation workshop with representatives of 12 high schools in Taipei, and there is much more to come. The scale was radically expanded. So it was something of an eye-opening surprise to the originators. One of the Taiwanese adopters described it this way: they are like a sponge. They, meaning the core group of this effort in Taiwan, they suck it in, and then they kind of bring it into the change lab to see what they think about it. So it is not so self-contained. They are actually stimulated from all directions. And an originator says, but it's integrated all into one and the same process. Exactly. And this very challenge was a very first issue there. And that, at the same time, there's implementation and adoption. At the same time, it looks entirely different in scale. Now, the second issue has to do with the material anchors. The group presented 3 key diagrams from their experience with this innovation, which kind of provide continuity with the original. Diagram of the cycle of expansive learning, depicting where they are moving in the cycle. Diagram of the zone of proximal development as they see it, in a way, what kind of historical transformation is happening. And thirdly, diagram of the desired future shape of the activity systems. These 3 types of diagrams are central to the original generic change laboratory, and they provide continuity between the original and the implementations. So here they are. This was the first one from their presentation. Sorry for the Chinese. This is the second one. The years and the indication of direction in a 4-field depicting the historical field of transformation, which we call zone of proximal development. And finally, a depiction of the desirable shape of the activity systems as they see the school in the next few years. Now, these critical encounter. They evoke the question of authorship. Will these models be appropriated by the participating teachers and students? So one of the Finnish adopters asked, this seems to be a plan from the interventionists, but somehow this seems to be a bit normative. To what extent is there room for the participants' agency? Is it a very hierarchical system in which you are told to do something? And if it is so, how can you grasp what the students themselves want? And one of the originators a little later continued, in the last slides you are representing two models which are primarily a product of your own research group's reflections and analysis. The main force of change has to come from the teachers and students and administrators involved in the process. The challenge is to make it possible that the models become models of the participants themselves. So leave room for contesting these and even discarding aspects of them so that the model that is actually implemented is appropriated and owned by the participants. In your case, it is a big challenge because we're talking about a very big school. So this was the second, let's say, challenging issue. In this time, it was the originators and other adopters who were challenging the implementation. In a way, the other way around compared to the first challenge. Now, to sum up this first case, in terms of stabilization and destabilization, the three key diagrams seem to serve as intermediate stabilizing devices, or ratchets, or material anchors, if you want, to crystallize what has been accomplished so far in the Taiwanese Change Laboratory. On the other hand, these diagrams also evoke the problematic challenge of ownership and authorship, which calls for reopening and reconstructing these models jointly with teachers and students. In other words, they serve as destabilizing second stimuli that pull the adopters to move forward. Something that might be compared to the metaphor of warping anchor, as Anna Cesani has done. Now, the second case. Don't worry, I will try to generalize from this. So, at the moment you probably feel a little bit lost, and that's also good. So, now the second case is about appropriation of the idea of sustainable physical mobility as a locally distributed process of expansive learning. This is more local. The previous one, these implementations are around the world. This is still very much limited to one city. The context. The graying of the population in Finland, radical increase of the elderly, wholesale move from institutionalized care to home care, increasing risk of social exclusion because of that, quick fixes, abrupt changes from various politicians and administrations, increasing pressures for privatization of services. All in this field of tensions, we had a project funded by the city in which the task was to search for new solutions. And two new key tools were created, namely what is called the mobility agreement and the service palette. And I will discuss this now. These two tools were connected to two separate layers of expansive learning, namely the frontline layer of workers and clients, to appropriate and implement the toolkit and practice of the mobility agreement to find the loss of physical mobility among the elderly clients. And the second layer was management layer to construct and implement a comprehensive service palette that explains the services available for home care clients. First, about the worker-client layer. A key element of this new toolkit of the mobility agreement is an exercise booklet, a physical artifact, which depicts basic physical exercises for the elderly. This became an important second stimulus and material anchor to the process. And I briefly describe a critical encounter between a client and a home care worker. In this case, it means an end user of the innovation and an adopter of the innovation, where the exercise booklet serves as second stimulus and material anchor. There is the booklet between the two, and here's a little bit about little fragments from their interaction. And care agreement is introduced. Lisa, the home care worker, says 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and she's actually counting how the client is standing up from the chair. Good, you can do this very nicely. What about dancing? Would you manage? Dancing? How come? Lisa laughs and shows dancing steps in the brochure, in the booklet. Here are dancing steps. Look at these, this kind of movement. And the client says, I have been dancing a lot when I was young. Well, then it will work very well. But it doesn't work because, and then the client laughs. It will work. So I mean, grab the chair there. Okay, try now. In front, to the side, to the back, in front, to the side, to the back. She moves her legs. Isn't it like this also when you dance? She laughs. My former husband was so eager to dance, but I can't do this all alone. I'm imagining that my mat is here now, like this. Yes, good. Do you feel bad? No. Nowhere? There's no bad feeling? No. And so she's dancing with the chair. So should I do these things by myself? Yeah, at least it's getting up from the chair, and if she shows the dancing steps in the booklet, if you can balance while you do these, we can do this together when we come to shower you then. Yes, then. Now this is an example of what is very typical, that this kind of critical encounter, in this critical encounter, the agentic actions which are taken, triggered by the use of the second stimulus or the material artifact, are actually also physical actions. Another critical encounter example briefly, where the mobility agreement acts together with the rubbish bag as a second stimulus and material anchor. The client has done regular physical exercises based on the mobility agreement. In this encounter, they employ the rubbish bag as a specific second stimulus, triggering the volitional action of taking out rubbish together. So the nurse says, if I take this heavier and you take the lighter rubbish bag, they go out together. After taking it out, they start talking about it. The nurse says, so, and then you do take the rubbish always out with us, home care workers. I mean, we always get out when home care visits you. This was what they had agreed in the mobility agreement. No, not always. They have taken them without. Somebody has taken the rubbish out without you. Yes. But it would be very good for you to take the rubbish always out with us. Yeah, okay, sometimes I have done that, gone out with them to take the rubbish out. It would be very important to agree that to be a regular habit, it would not matter if somebody suggested to take the rubbish out. You should always respond, let's go together. Yes, that's the point, says the client. And so here's another example of how the second stimuli, in this case, it's not only the mobility agreement, but it's connected to the incidentally employed rubbish bag. The care agreement and the exercise booklet serve as stabilizing devices, ratchets, material anchors, in the introduction of regular physical exercises in the lives of home care clients in the work of their caregivers. They also serve as destabilizing second stimuli as they trigger and support novel agentive actions, in this case, for instance, remembering the deceased husband through dancing with a chair, or reinforcing the agreed upon division of labor between the client and home care workers, which has been eroding through the use of the garbage bag. These cases also demonstrate that the deliberately used second stimuli, in this case the mobility agreement and exercise booklet, frequently need to be complemented and enriched with incidentally grabbed artifacts, such as the chair or the garbage bag, that take on the function of additional second stimuli. So, in 2010, the mobility agreement received the City of Helsinki Mayor's Innovation Prize. In 2014, we have about 45% of all the regular clients of the Helsinki Home Care do have now the mobility agreement. And this is gradually increasing. It is not an easy process. It's a slow process. Now, a little bit about how an integrative service palette, which would become a second stimulus and emerging material anchor, a spearhead toward integrated home care. Why integrated? If you look at these examples, you see why. These are critical encounters in the intervention. Home care manager 3 says, I look at the future with great fear. Life and tasks there, that separation. I think it's a consequence of a failure of the whole society and the whole education system. Many things kind of erode the principle of holistic care. So it becomes performing only minimum services. And then there's the client who has a life. And we only visit and take care of the wound or distribute medications and such. And we think that's it. Another home care manager. First, they, the practical nurses working there, read 2 years about life. Then the last part of training, they study the tasks. And it is the tasks in the end, so it does become centered on tasks. And they do master them. There's no difficulty in taking out the garbage. They master it very well. They also master wounds and taking blood pressure, but somehow the tasks do not connect to the whole. So how could that be fixed? I don't know. And home care management somehow I think we are not taking comprehensive responsibility. It is not clear, comprehensive responsibility for the situation of the client. Our services have been split into small pieces with all the support services. To satisfy the client and to handle the totality in a manageable way with regard to our resources and the client's needs, who has the responsibility for that? So this is the situation with which they are struggling, and they see the dire consequences every day. So this effort led them to, as a first step, to try to anchor this shift toward more integrated or holistic care by means of constructing a service palette. Home care manager 6 says, well, we have experienced that the grannies know what their neighbors have gotten. We get phone calls saying, how come I have not been offered this service even though the neighbor gets it? And the caller knows that it's available. This makes me think that we cannot conceal our services. You have to show openly what we have, and that this may be good for you, but this is inappropriate for you. Exactly. But when they are chosen by negotiation, but they know, and in the future they will know even more. Yes, then you cannot anymore give everybody the same. No, we can. And of course, this is the very problem. At the same time, if you open this whole repertoire of services, this means that you have to start to be careful in how you fashion them for each client. How can we allow the client to decide? I take foot care, massage, cosmetological services, manicure, and preferably music therapy. But I certainly do not take anything that includes physical exercise, and I don't bother to do much myself. So this service palette requires that we know how to sell. Select from these, but do not select those because these are not good for you. You can only choose from these. And so this is the dilemma that they are facing, moving forward to some sort of a negotiated and holistic care. And this was how they depicted this movement. And here's what was the result: the service palette as second stimulus and material anchor. Now, how is this connected to the layer at the worker client level? Home care manager 2 says, the basic assessment is done in home care for those clients who can still get up from the chair. But I think that it is too demanding for home care to assess alone the mobility and functional capacity of those who are already tied to the bed or wheelchair, those who cannot get up from the chair. So here we need a physical therapist. We don't need to do it alone, but we are responsible for those who still do get up from the chair. So there are two services here in the palette. One is the assessment, multidisciplinary or multi-professional assessment. The other one is the mobility agreement. And they are interconnected. There will always be assessment and mobility agreement. Mobility exercises at home are very good, but they must be included in the agreement. So gradually, these two are starting to meet one another. The overall palette and the specific tool of the mobility agreement. Now, the service palette here serves as a stabilizing device or material anchor of a step toward integrated home care. It also serves as a very destabilizing second stimulus as it made visible the magnitude and and difficulty of the challenge of integration. And to sum up this, you can see that this type of learning might be schematically depicted with the help of the notions of first and second stimuli, agentive actions, and the construction of a new concept. What is important here is that these material anchors are partially interconnected or they overlap one another, namely the service palette and the mobility agreement. One is included in the other. Now, I'm coming to the conclusion. My initial question was, how is a local innovation distributed and generalized so as to have widespread and sustainable societal impact? To make a very simple claim, sort of summarizing claim, is that I think that the field of scaling up and sustaining innovations in education particularly is dominated by simplistic answers and efforts to almost forcefully scale up everything. I worry greatly about this, and I think it's tightly associated with other worrisome trends, high-stakes testing, marketization of education. All these are bundled together. Basically, the neoliberal agenda to transform education into marketplace. My alternative, which I'm here proposing, is that committed appropriation and implementation of innovations may be seen as a spatially and temporally distributed process of expansive learning. In terms of spreading in space, such learning is triggered in critical encounters, which involve breaking out of paralyzing conflicts or motives by means of double stimulation, that is, the use of artifacts as second stimuli to trigger and enhance agent volitional actions. These volitional actions certainly cannot be predetermined and prepackaged. In terms of temporal continuity and sustainability, the temporal dimension, distributed expansive learning is crucially dependent on the formation and use of material anchors, that is, material artifacts that serve as second stimuli and provide ratchets that stabilize the longitudinal learning efforts, provide some points which in a way cannot be eliminated easily. The very same artifacts, for instance the diagrams, mobility agreement, service palette, serve both as stabilizing devices, ratchets, material anchors, and as destabilizing second stimuli that enable movement forward or walking. Artifacts used as second stimuli or material anchors include not only the deliberately introduced conceptual tools and models, but also artifacts opportunistically grabbed by the subjects. And there needs to be space for that. Expansive implementation processes generate challenges to question and develop further the very original innovations themselves. Can the change laboratory be radically extended in scale, like the Taiwanese are suggesting? How can the mobility agreement be connected to efforts to fight memory loss and social isolation among the elderly? It's not just about physical mobility. These are tightly interconnected. How can the service palette be turned into practical integration of services rather than just a document? So, the issue here is this type of learning is very open-ended. At the same time, it must be pursued at least as rigorously as any more conventional form of learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring lecture, which, as I hoped, connected conceptual challenges in development with illustrations of empirical work intended to transform situations and engage people in collective and individual learning. We now have time for questions. We should have some microphones here. Someone to distribute them. So please raise your hand if you want to raise a question.
There's one in front and running very back.
Yeah.
So that's a spatial distribution of microphones.
Green. We have one question here and one question at the very end. Rupert, okay, please.
Well, first of all, thank you for your talk. My name is Engestrom. I work at the University of Amsterdam at an Institute for Educational Research, and we do a lot of policy research. And, well, my general question is, how can, let's say, your work, your insights, how can it help to educate, let's say, policymakers or politicians? Because often, you know, it's, well, in the Netherlands, it is, let's say, evidence-based policy, right? And the evidence is, well, as we know, there is only one way to create evidence.
Numbers.
Numbers, etc. While you sketch quite a qualitative approach, and also you depicted that the necessary diversity of all these practices. So what is your argument? What would you say to my Minister of Education?
First of all, let me emphasize that what has happened in our work over the past 20 years, interestingly, is that the most dramatic demand for this type of research and interventions is now coming from the global south. Interestingly enough, there the social, economic, and ecological challenges are so big and so dramatic that, you know, they just override. People need something to work with. And this is, to me, it's the greatest source of hope. Because at the moment, as you say, the sort of evidence-based wave, which is connected to the more broader neoliberal tendencies in our fields, in the industrialized West, have made it rather difficult to approach some layers of the society with this type of ideas. I would say that perhaps that the way to do it is by smaller examples, which if you can generate something that demonstrates that this works and also generates numbers. For instance, this Helsinki case is nice because it has actually generated also a lot of numbers. It is spreading in such a way that they monitor every year how many mobility agreements are made, etc., etc. They also try to monitor how this improves the perspective of longevity that the elderly person can stay independently at home, which is a very serious economic issue. And if these kinds of let's say, indicators, also quantitative indicators, can be gradually built into this kind of efforts, they have more clout. However, the problem is that we are now moving numbers first, and then the rest comes if it ever comes. And it should be the other way around. Maybe by demonstrations. Eventually, my private speculation is that when the global south starts to walk all over us in terms of all kinds of indicators, and we have to realize that they are doing something radically different, it might be the time to learn from them.
Thank you. Back of the room, is that good? No, use the microphone. And shout a little.
Well, thank you for those very interesting examples. But of course, we're doing social science research here, and you started with a theoretical framework. And I wondered to what extent any of the assumptions you were making could be empirically tested, or whether you wanted to do that. One thing I was thinking is that, of course, there are quite a few approaches to institutional change. One that I know about, I'm saying it's a good approach, but it wouldn't make your fundamental assumption that change is driven by contradiction. Bohemian dialogue was taken up by Peter Senge in his book on learning organizations. And there the idea was to open a space of dialogue for people to design their futures. And this works. I'm not saying it does work, I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm just saying, how would you empirically test and ground your theoretical frameworks?
That's a very large question, thank you. I can only perhaps refer to relatively large literature, indeed this kind of empirical work that is being done and has been published over the past 20 years. But basically, obviously, there's no way in this kind of situation to prove that your paradigm is right. That's not the way social science works. On variation theory of learning, and I know it's starting to happen. Hopefully there's more about this in the future, where we put together radically different approaches to look at the same cases and the same data, and then to work out not what might be called a common ground or somehow merge these, but to actually learn from one another. I don't think that there is any better way that scientists have developed so far. In the end, for us, the issue is what happens on the ground. How these change efforts actually lead to some significant learning. Learning, however, for us means actual material changes in people's lives, not just changing of minds.
Thank you. More questions? Comments? Yeah, please. State your name, please. Let us know who you are.
Alison John from the UK Open University. I just want to ask you something about the practicalities of change. At the Open University, we're going through some change at the moment, trying to work towards...
Welcome to the club.
Yes, exactly. Just trying to reimagine what an Open University would be like if we reinvented it now. Now, what I like about Change Lab is the cultural, historical roots of it. So it's rooted in what people have been doing. But at the beginning, you mentioned imitation and transplantation. Obviously here, there are new ideas, completely different ways of thinking interjected in. So how do you ensure the balance between this cultural, historical, and the interjection? So can you give us some examples of where you had to deal with it?
Yeah, this another very, obviously we're not operating in a vacuum. These more, let's say, commonplace approaches to change are indeed dominant. And how to find space and perhaps some sort of coexistence with them is indeed, thinking of the universities at the moment, I think that, the best word that I can say is, think where you stand. The people who are closest to you, the people who are actually the, let's say, recipients of these changes, those who actually will experience the consequences, need to somehow start to make their voices heard. And this is a very hard situation for an old person like me who has lived through the 1970s when the university people were in the forefronts of fighting against injustice and demonstrating against the Vietnam War or whatever. Where the heck is that now? We're all like sheep. It's very nice to sit in our conferences, but when we go home and we realize that my department might not exist next year, we're very quiet. And I think that we should do something about it among ourselves, not blame anybody else.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Yours over here. Oh, we can take that. You can take the next one. Please.
Thank you so much.
The mic doesn't work. The microphone doesn't work. So Jos, you can.
Whether my microphone works, yes. Thank you.
Artifact.
My name is Jos Bijshuizen from Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. I was wondering, thank you very much for your very nice and thought-provoking presentation. I was wondering whether the quality of the artifacts is somehow embedded in your theory. I mean, the metaphors which are materialized in the artifacts do determine the quality of the innovation. And when you choose an inappropriate metaphor, a service palette or whatever, then that may turn down the whole proliferation process, I think.
It's a very extremely important point. However, I would say determine, but afford. So determine sounds a little bit too much. I think artifacts are always polyvalent, and they are never fully deterministic. There's always multiple potentials and multiple possibilities involved in any artifact, but indeed, they are also limited. In that sense, they don't afford certain things. Let's say a notion of development which is depicted in, let's say, closed nested circles is very different from a notion of development which is depicted as an open network or spiral or something like that. And they afford different kinds of thinking and action. So yes, one answer to that is to try and understand different kinds of artifacts and representations. However, I couldn't go into that. We try to think about them in terms of perhaps, you know, there are ranging from very specific prototypes, which are almost pictures, to algorithms, systems models, and all the way up to what we call germ cell models, which kind of depict a foundational idea which has huge consequences. Think about when Mahatma Gandhi was at the center of the liberation movement of India. The key artifact that he was proposing as the symbol, but also a real tool, was the simple spinning loom for making your own garments, which almost every home in India had. And this became both the symbol of the liberation and also something of the foundational tool for building a new economy. So artifacts at the level of what we call germ cells do look very different, often deceptively simple, compared to, let's say, systems models that engineers and natural scientists often prefer. Systems models are very good for diagnostic purposes, but do not necessarily give you the vision and direction. So you need to operate with a range of different types of artifacts rather than put your faith in one home.
Let's have another go.
Okay, let me try the artifact. Now it works. My name is Linda Kovacs-Buchberger. I am from the University of Belgrade. And I would like to ask you, I would like to get back to your claim that the Global South is very interested towards the approach, and to ask you whether you have experience in working with, or your colleagues, in working with the part of the Global South which is on the Global North, which means Roma, for example,
yes, or
marginalized or excluded, because in that area I think that they are also facing, so the innovations are facing the hard pressure of the World Bankish approaches, and this approach would be much more empowering. So researchers working with Roma are actually seeking for some advice in that respect. Thank you.
Thank you for the extremely important comment. Yes, the Global South is among us here in the North. I fully agree with you. So my current project is called Learning in Productive Social Movements. And the focal movement on which we have been working now is called New York City Community Land Initiative, which in New York City there's a huge number of homeless people or people who are facing the prospect of homelessness in the near future. So this movement tries to construct new affordable forms of housing for the homeless or at-risk population. And so it's an example perhaps of what you're saying. However, you also added, for instance, the Roma people, and you added the sort of ethnic issues that obviously they are also involved in any kind of marginalized population. You also have ethnic issues, often also race. But I would say here that this is the direction where we're heading very strongly. Looking at communities which are redefining themselves in the midst of these pressures of global capitalism, whether they are here in the North or in the South.
Yeah, my name is Beatrice Rigorion from Italy, from the University of Italy. Thank you very much for your talk, Yrjo. And every time I listen to you and I read your paper, I have always one question in mind. And finally, have the opportunity to ask you. It's the way you theorize the data and the way you connect it to the more broader theoretical framework is really interesting. But is it the context that you study are very peculiar? There are people that do want to change, and there is a positive attitude toward the material, the destruction, and the context that you set up. I wonder if this would apply also to school, to learning in school, where most of the time you have students that do not want to change and have a negative attitude toward the material that your teacher and the researcher gave to them. So how much your theories are applicable, and how do you see this transfer to school context?
Big and good question. I'm glad to hear that it's been bothering you. So I'm not the only one. But I think that the issue here is, first of all, school change. We still kind of think of it as sort of a marginal frame factor in our studies or whatever would be better teaching and learning. In a way, like Yrjo Engestrom used to say, that we should realize that we are doing our research in a moving train. It's changing in any case, whether we want it or not. So we better start understanding what is happening, rather than waiting for an opportune moment when everybody is willing to make a big step. So it seems to me that we are underestimating the inherent potential of change already going on. And this change is sometimes very ugly. But it's not only ugly. It's not only privatization, high-stakes testing, etc. There is also other movements. What I miss from much of studies on learning and instruction is that they would connect to these stronger and more durable underlying currents of development and change, which would potentially energize also the students and teachers to see that they're part of something bigger. This is usually missing. If you go back into classic dramatic periods of educational change, you often see that they are connected to educators and educational systems taking a stance, becoming part of a bigger societal transformation. We have the great opportunity historically to start talking about what is it that is common good or commons that needs to be reintroduced, expanded and built on, and that knowledge is a crucial part of it, and that schools can play a big role in revitalizing the commons in our societies. We're not yet there. I think that there are small pockets of efforts, but at the moment, in my opinion, you don't need to wait for a particular local population to become active. I think what you need to do is to find the underlying currents and start making them explicit. And oftentimes you realize that there's much more potential than meets the eye.
My name is Katrin Ubrig. I'm from Germany, and I'm like with two hats here. I'm working in a company as a change management consultant and also in a public charity organization. And my experience is, and thank you for that, I feel like you are doing a bridge from the academic side also to the, so-called real world. And I'm interested in how is your experience concerning developing emotional competencies and to develop your own confidence that you can do the change by yourself, as you also showed, that helping the people to help themselves at the end. I would be interested in if you have experience in that field as well. Thank you.
I think what you're referring to is understanding of how agency or transformative agency emerges among people. And you know, the studies of agency have been dominated by the notion of agency as a property. Either a dormant property or something that can be categorized, classified, and measured, you know, as a locus of control or whatever you want. But the idea of agency as actions needs to be now built on. In other words, to look at what kinds of actions bring out and foster transformative agency. And I do believe that these actions, the critical actions, are those in which there's both reliance and use of this relational aspect of agency that typically Ann Edwards has written about as relational agency, but perhaps most of all, the focus on objects that can be somehow transformed with the help of mediating artifacts. So this agency without objects and agency without others is empty. You can't, there's no such box inside you. It happens through actions. And how to orchestrate and facilitate those actions that build up agency as movement is the issue here. So I kind of don't think that we can somehow approach it by means of very traditional psychology. I think with that role, you know, whether it's self-determination theory or locus of control or whatever, tends to lead in the end in a well-known classification. So these people will have a little more agency than those others, and I don't think that's useful.
Thank you. Any more questions? You have to raise your hands because it's difficult to see. Any more questions? Well, I have a question. What do you think? It's very interesting with this. I was wondering about this issue of accountability as a theoretical and as an empirical problem. In the examples you showed about the intervention work, the institution will still be responsible for the care delivered. And researchers cannot step in and take over responsibility. They're not authorized, they don't have professional control. So I was wondering if in your work, in these 20 years, you've seen these tensions that you know, there's no way that the institution, healthcare or school or private organization can say, you know, blame the researchers or give them, they have to kind of profit from the experiences of the researchers, yet pursue their tasks so that they, you know, live up to the ethical standards, legal standards, whatever, you know, very concrete standards about when and how to deliver care. Can you say something about this, how this accountability interacts with the issue of intervention?
Yeah. In these, especially in this intervention process like change laboratories, it works so that if you don't get from the participants the point when they start blaming you, you have failed. Be prepared to be blamed, because there is a moment when this becomes a bit painful for the participants. When they look in the mirror and they start digging into the situation, it's not necessarily very happy and easy and nice. And that's when they need to say, what the hell are you doing coming here to show all the dirt? And you know, who are you to say that we're doing things wrong? Like when we work often with the medical settings, and in this situation, it's very useful if you can bring in the real end recipients, like the patients. You can say, look, I'm dying, and I think it's your fault. Then they don't know who to blame anymore after that, and that's a kind of a good situation. But basically, there is this blame or looking for an easy explanation, which automatically must come up, and that's a step toward transformative agency. If that never happens, I think you have remained too much on the surface level. You haven't touched the nerve. So be prepared for confrontation. Of course, it's important to prepare it for it so that it doesn't just blow up the whole situation. And oftentimes, what is important then is to have enough evidence. So when the doctors say this case is an exception, you say, okay, let's look at the next one. And then there's a second exception, and the third exception. After the fourth exception, they start laughing and saying, I think that we only have exceptions. And then you have a better ground to move forward. But you have to work for this. And the accountability eventually then will be transformed. Oftentimes, unfortunately, they forget that you did something useful. Yeah, you don't necessarily get all the credit which you would deserve. So,
okay. But that's the meeting point. Do we have any more questions? If not, before we close, I would like to invite Yrjo to come up to the stage.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. And have a wonderful rest of the conference.